Philosophy generated science by essentially inventing intellectual thought and rigorous reasoning. Philosophy continues to influence science by framing debates and bringing awareness to science's weaknesses. Philosophy frames the questions and sets the rules of debate. It does this by exploring the landscape of what might be true and figuring out how different approaches to truth interrelate. The dialogue of philosophy focuses on logic, rules of argumentation, and the definition of abstract concepts. The approach and practice of science, including the scientific method, arose out of philosophy. Science is a strategy for arriving at consensus answers to questions about the natural world. It focuses on discovering facts, laws, and mechanisms. Often what are discovered are new objects that were previously unseen and unknown to exist. The objects that science discovers were there all along, but were either too small to see cells, molecules, atoms, electrons too far away to see galaxies, or required reorganizing available information to see genes, structure of DNA, geotectonic plates, the ionosphere. Science also discovers historical events, the Ice Age, the birth of the solar system, and predicts future events, comets passing by, the death of the sun. Biological science focuses on discovering mechanisms, evolution, cell division, biochemical processes. Physics prefers rules and laws, gravity, quantum forces. The social sciences settle for statistical patterns, behavioral tendencies, market mechanisms, psychological processes. Philosophy of mind and the scientific study of consciousness are two fields that are interacting closely on an unresolved issue and present an interesting history of how philosophy and science work together. Philosophy of mind has debated the nature of the mind for centuries, since Aristotle, and has developed dozens of interrelated frameworks, often called the isms, dualism, functionalism, materialism, reductionism, epiphenomenalism. Consciousness has fascinated thinkers, including scientists, and especially psychologists and physicists, for a very long time, again, since Aristotle. William James, a philosopher and one of the founders of modern psychology in the 1890s, had consciousness as one of his main interests. However, the psychological behaviorism movement of the 1960s and 1970s, led by B.F. Skinner, applied enormous peer pressure to crush the credibility of consciousness as a scientific object, partly to bring more rigor and discipline to the field of psychology. Consciousness began to return as a legitimate object of study in the 1990s, partly thanks to Francis Crick, discoverer of DNA, who lent his reputation to launching the neuroscientific study of consciousness as a credible and precisely defined field. This led to philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists gathering in annual meetings to debate approaches to elucidating what consciousness is and how the brain produces it. There is a parallel gathering of philosophers and physicists who debate the relationship of quantum mechanics to consciousness. The outcome of all of this is a fresh array of viewpoints in philosophy that are informed by scientific discoveries, along with more precise definitions in science that are informed by the philosophical debate. Austin has a reasonable answer. I want to extend it a bit. First, I wouldn't agree with Bertrand Russell entirely, who was a philosopher, in that philosophy isn't what we don't know, but is that which we don't know with certainty because it is not experimentally testable at this time, per a point by Austin. I think Russell was making a tongue-in-cheek comment about the difference of science and philosophy. Philosophy is a pursuit of knowledge by rational means alone. It is often tested by our experience, but the experience is difficult to tie down to something concrete. For example, we all believe there is a real world beyond our thinking self, but is there for sure? Philosophy would try answer that question, but is not likely to ever end up with anything conclusive. Whereas science uses testable experience to validate rationally derived hypotheses. It has a process by which to bring some level of concreteness to our knowledge. Quite often, philosophical inquiry leads to scientific angles to investigate. In other words, philosophy is the precursor to the science. Something I think many don't realize, or don't acknowledge, is that the methods of science, that it even works, is based on philosophy. There is a field called the philosophy of science which looks at many of the presuppositions of the scientific process. The process seems to work well, but there are many things assumed that we can't say for sure we are right. For example, it is usually assumed that the physical laws of today are not changing. Thus we can extrapolate back in time to explain the past by what we observe today. It is also assumed that breaking the whole into parts is a reasonable method of analysis. For the most part that has worked well, but in the complexity being studied today, we are finding more and more that the knowledge about some things is destroyed in the analysis process. Sometimes the whole is much greater than the parts. What are the laws? Do they even exist, or does it just seem so based on the ways our minds work? What is time? What is life? And so on. There is a whole worldview assumption in the sciences as well. For example, I'm looking into a possible PhD on the views of science from Eastern and Western religious perspectives, and I can say already that the assumptions about the world make a big difference. There is a mystical element in the Eastern perspective, and any mystical route is denied, for the most part, in the Western perspective. These are philosophical questions. People will hold dogmatic positions on this, but in the end, you can't really know which is right. One's spiritual experiences, or lack thereof, drives a lot of what they think about the world and the essence of scientific pursuits. So, science and philosophy can never be divorced from each other. The more science we discover, the more philosophical questions that come along with it. And without philosophy, science would have never been born.